September 12, 1943, 2300 hours. The North Atlantic descends toward the Sahara like a blade of blue steel cutting through the darkness. 40 miles off the Moroccan coast, the U-617's crew qualified for early repatriation based on their exemplary conduct during internment and absence of evidence connecting them to war crimes. British authorities had concluded that submarine warfare, despite its brutal effectiveness, had generally been conducted within accepted military conventions. Unlike concentration camp personnel or SS units, naval crews could be released without extensive political screening. The journey home began with rail transport from Yorkshire to Dover, then ferry crossing to Calais, and finally train service through devastated European landscapes to occupied Germany. For men who had left their homeland as representatives of a powerful military machine, the return revealed the war's true cost in terms that no intelligence report could convey. German cities lay in ruins that staggered even veterans accustomed to destruction. Hamburg, Brandy's birthplace and location of the shipyard that had built U-617, had been devastated by Allied bombing campaigns that transformed urban centers into landscapes resembling archaeological sites. The submarine pens that had sheltered dozens of U-boats were concrete tombs filled with twisted steel and stagnant water. Civilian populations struggled with malnutrition, disease, and psychological trauma that made military casualties seem almost trivial by comparison. Displaced persons camps housed millions of refugees from territories now under Soviet control. Currency had collapsed, forcing economic transactions to revert to primitive barter systems that reduced proud citizens to scavenging for survival necessities. For returning prisoners, the challenge involved not just personal readjustment, but fundamental reconceptualization of their role in German society. Military skills that had defined their identity were now irrelevant or actively discouraged by occupation authorities determined to eliminate Germany's capacity for future aggression. Technical knowledge of submarine operations had no civilian applications in a nation forbidden to possess naval forces beyond coastal patrol vessels. Brandy found work in Hamburg's reconstruction efforts, using his engineering background to help rebuild the port facilities that Allied bombing had destroyed. The irony was profound. The same technical expertise that had once threatened Allied shipping now contributed to restoring commerce that would ultimately benefit Germany's former enemies. But meaningful work provided psychological anchor during difficult years when national purpose seemed permanently lost. Many crew members struggled with more serious adjustment problems. Heinrich Weber, U-617's former radio operator, developed alcoholism that destroyed his marriage and prevented steady employment. Kurt Fischer, the submarine's engineer, committed suicide in 1948, leaving notes that blamed his death on inability to find purpose in peacetime existence. Such casualties reflected broader patterns among German veterans whose identity had been so completely defined by military service that civilian life seemed impossible to navigate. Others adapted more successfully by embracing educational opportunities that occupation authorities provided as part of denazification and democratization programs. Technical schools offered training in construction, manufacturing, and commercial skills that could support family life in reconstructed Germany. Some former submarine personnel eventually emigrated to countries like Argentina or Australia that welcomed German technical expertise despite recent hostilities. The physical remains of U-617 became subjects of salvage operations that reflected post-war priorities rather than historical preservation. Moroccan authorities, seeking valuable materials for their own reconstruction efforts, authorized commercial recovery of steel, brass, and other metals from the submarine's hull. By 1950, little remained of the vessel beyond scattered debris buried in coastal sand. Local fishermen occasionally recovered artifacts that ocean currents carried ashore: pieces of equipment, fragments of hull plating, personal items that had belonged to the crew during their 18 months of combat service. These objects entered local markets as curiosities, their historical significance unknown to purchasers who valued them primarily as exotic decorations or conversation pieces. British naval historians began collecting documentation related to U-617's final patrol as part of broader efforts to record lessons learned during the Battle of the Atlantic. The submarine's engagement with lead light-equipped aircraft provided valuable case study material for understanding how technological innovation had shifted warfare's balance decisively in favor of Allied forces. Wing Commander McPherson, who had led the attack that destroyed U-617, participated in post-war conferences where Allied and German military personnel discussed submarine warfare's evolution. These sessions, initially awkward encounters between former enemies, gradually developed into professional exchanges that contributed to NATO naval doctrine during the early Cold War period. The German submarine crews demonstrated remarkable skill and courage throughout the war. McPherson observed during one such conference in 1952, "Our victory reflected technological and industrial advantages rather than superior personal qualities. Under different circumstances, with different resource allocations, the outcome might have been very different." Such acknowledgments provided some measure of recognition for German naval personnel who had fought honorably in a losing cause.
Professional respect between former enemies helped validate sacrifice and competence that political circumstances had rendered strategically meaningless. For veterans like Brandy, such recognition offered partial compensation for years of service that had ultimately served destructive rather than constructive purposes. The broader lessons of U-617's story emerged gradually as historians gained access to classified documents and interviewed surviving participants.
The submarine's fate illustrated how modern warfare had become a contest between industrial systems rather than individual courage. Technology, intelligence, and resource allocation determined outcomes more decisively than traditional military virtues like bravery and tactical skill. Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic reflected successful integration of scientific innovation, industrial production, and intelligence operations that created systematic advantages over German submarine forces. Radar, sonar, code-breaking, long-range aircraft, and coordination systems combined to transform submarine hunting from difficult art to routine science. But technology alone had not assured Allied success. Organizational factors, training programs, command structures, resource allocation systems had proven equally important in converting technological potential into operational effectiveness. German submarine forces had possessed advanced technology, but lacked the institutional frameworks needed to employ it optimally against opponents who combined innovation with superior coordination. The human dimension remained crucial, even in technology-dominated warfare. Allied aircrew like McPherson had demonstrated the courage and competence needed to employ new weapons effectively under combat conditions. German submarine crews like Brandy's had maintained professional standards and mutual loyalty despite increasingly hopeless circumstances. Individual quality mattered, but only within contexts shaped by broader strategic and technological factors. Brandy's post-war writings reflected sophisticated understanding of these complex relationships between personal and systemic factors in modern warfare. His memoirs, published in Germany during the 1960s, provided detailed analysis of submarine operations that influenced naval thinking throughout the Cold War period. "We believed that superior seamanship and individual courage could overcome material disadvantages," Brandy wrote in conclusions that summarized his wartime experience. "This belief sustained us through months of increasing danger and diminishing success. But modern warfare is ultimately decided by industrial capacity, technological innovation, and intelligence superiority rather than personal heroism alone." Such insights proved prophetic, as Cold War naval competition reproduced many patterns that had characterized World War II submarine warfare. Nuclear propulsion, advanced sonar systems, and satellite navigation created new technological dimensions to underwater combat. But fundamental principles remained constant. Victory would belong to forces that most effectively integrated human competence with technological capability. The story of U-617 thus transcended its immediate historical context to provide lessons relevant to subsequent military conflicts. Professional competence, individual courage, and unit cohesion remained necessary components of military effectiveness. But these traditional virtues required combination with systematic advantages in technology, intelligence, and industrial support to achieve strategic success against capable opponents. For the families of U-617's crew, the war's end brought closure to years of uncertainty and grief. Wives and children who had received their last letters in August 1943 finally learned the fate of husbands and fathers who had disappeared into the Atlantic's darkness. Most family members found comfort in knowing that their loved ones had died serving their country rather than in meaningless accidents or civilian bombing raids. Memorial services in Hamburg and other German ports honored submarine crews whose sacrifice had been rendered politically problematic by Germany's defeat and subsequent revelations about Nazi war crimes. These ceremonies, modest affairs attended primarily by families and veterans, provided opportunities for grief and remembrance that official German policies had discouraged during the immediate post-war period. The broader German public remained ambivalent about military commemoration during decades when national identity required careful balance between honoring sacrifice and acknowledging guilt. Submarine veterans occupied particularly complex positions in these discussions, having served with honor in warfare that had legitimate military objectives despite being conducted by a regime whose ultimate purposes proved morally indefensible. International perspectives on German submarine warfare evolved gradually as Cold War tensions replaced World War II animosities. Former Allied nations found themselves allied with West Germany against Soviet expansion, creating diplomatic incentives to emphasize shared democratic values rather than wartime hostilities. Professional military cooperation between NATO navies required acknowledgement of German naval competence that political circumstances had temporarily obscured. U-617's story thus became part of broader historical narratives that sought to distinguish between individual military service and political systems that such service had supported. German submarine crews could be honored for their courage and competence while condemning the Nazi regime that had directed their sacrifice toward destructive ends. Such distinctions reflected mature understanding of warfare's moral complexity that immediate post-war emotions had prevented. Professional soldiers could serve honorably, even when their political leadership pursued immoral objectives. Military competence deserved recognition even when employed in ultimately unjust causes. Human courage retained value regardless of strategic circumstances that rendered such courage politically meaningless. The final phase of U-617's historical legacy involved incorporation into educational programs designed to teach lessons about warfare, technology, and human endurance. Maritime museums in Germany, Britain, and the United States developed exhibits that used submarine warfare to illustrate broader themes about industrial conflict and technological innovation. These educational efforts emphasized the systematic rather than heroic dimensions of modern warfare. Visitors learned about radar development, code-breaking operations, industrial production systems, and intelligence coordination rather than individual combat exploits. The goal was to demonstrate how democratic societies had successfully mobilized scientific and industrial resources to defeat totalitarian opponents. But educational programs also preserved recognition of individual sacrifice and competence that systematic analysis might otherwise obscure. The courage of submarine crews operating in impossible circumstances deserved remembrance alongside acknowledgement of technological factors that had determined strategic outcomes. Human dimensions of warfare retained importance even when broader patterns reflected impersonal forces. Brandy's personal story concluded with his death in Hamburg in 1987, having lived to see German reunification and NATO expansion that validated Allied victory in ways that immediate post-war occupation had not achieved. His funeral attracted surviving crew members, former British naval personnel, and historians whose research had preserved U-617's story for future generations. The memorial service reflected reconciliation that time and shared values had made possible between former enemies. British and German naval officers served as pallbearers, acknowledging professional respect that transcended national boundaries and wartime hostilities. Such ceremonies demonstrated humanity's capacity for healing wounds that military conflict had inflicted upon international relationships. Contemporary visitors to the Moroccan coast occasionally discover artifacts that remind them of U-617's final battle. Pieces of metal, fragments of equipment, and other debris emerge from shifting sands that have covered the submarine's remains for decades. These objects provide tangible connections to events that shaped the modern world's emergence from global warfare. Local Moroccan historians have begun documenting the submarine's story as part of broader efforts to preserve their region's World War II history. The engagement between U-617 and British aircraft represents one of many dramatic episodes that occurred along African coastlines during the war's global expansion beyond European boundaries. The desert that sheltered Brandy's crew during their final march has remained largely unchanged since 1943. Sand dunes continue their eternal migration across landscapes that have witnessed countless human dramas throughout history. The permanence of natural forces provides perspective on the temporary nature of human conflicts that once seemed to threaten civilization's survival. Yet the technologies and institutional innovations that emerged from World War II submarine warfare continue influencing contemporary military operations. Radar, sonar, electronic intelligence, and coordinated air-sea operations remain fundamental components of naval strategy. The systematic approaches to warfare that defeated German submarines have evolved into doctrines that guide current military planning. The human lessons of U-617's story retain equal relevance for understanding modern warfare's challenges. Professional competence, unit cohesion, and individual courage remain necessary qualities for military effectiveness. But these traditional virtues must be integrated with technological capabilities and institutional frameworks that reflect contemporary warfare's systematic character. Educational value extends beyond military applications to broader questions about technology, leadership, and human endurance under extreme circumstances. Submarine warfare provides case studies in decision-making under pressure, technological adaptation, and psychological resilience that have relevance for civilian as well as military leadership development. The story of U-617 thus represents more than historical curiosity about vanished weapons and forgotten battles. It illustrates timeless themes about human courage, technological innovation, and strategic thinking that remain relevant for understanding contemporary challenges. The submarine's fate provides lessons about hubris and adaptation, individual sacrifice and systematic advantage that transcend specific military contexts. As ocean waters continue their eternal circulation around continents that have witnessed countless conflicts, the remains of U-617 rest beneath Moroccan sands like a monument to human ambition and limitation. The submarine achieved none of its strategic objectives, saved no German lives, and contributed nothing to ultimate victory. Yet the courage and competence of her crew deserve remembrance as examples of human excellence that retain value regardless of political circumstances. History isn't just written, it's remembered through those who still care to listen. The men of U-617 fought with honor in a cause that proved unworthy of their sacrifice, demonstrating that individual virtue can transcend political failure. Their story reminds us that wars are won by systems and technologies, but fought by human beings whose courage and competence deserve recognition regardless of strategic outcomes. What story should we tell next? Subscribe to keep their memory alive. Your feedback is incredibly valuable and helps me keep making better content for you. Slices through nocturnal swells at 14 knots, her hull vibrating with the rhythm of a caged animal's heartbeat. In the cramped control room, Captain Lieutenant Albrecht Brandy grips his Zeiss binoculars with hands that tremble from 48 hours without sleep. The air tastes of hot oil, unwashed bodies, and something more primal, the metallic tang of fear that seeps through steel plates when death circles overhead. The submarine's interior pulses with the crimson glow of battle lighting. 44 men breathe the same recycled air, their faces gaunt beneath thin beards, eyes hollow from weeks of running. The Atlantic has become a graveyard for their kind, and each night brings fresh horrors transmitted through crackling radio static. U-boat command's messages grow shorter, more desperate. Return home, find safe harbor, survive. Above them, the Mediterranean sky stretches infinite and black, dotted with stars that offer no comfort to men trapped in a steel coffin. The waves lap against the conning tower with the patient persistence of time itself. In the distance, barely audible through the diesel engine's rumble, comes a sound that freezes blood in German veins. The distant drone of Merlin engines, growing stronger, hunting. Brandy adjusts his white-topped cap, a gesture of authority that feels increasingly hollow. His Knight's Cross hangs heavy against his chest, earned in the glory days of 1941, when U-boats ruled the Atlantic like wolves among sheep. Those days belong to another war, another world. Now they are the hunted, and the hunters have grown clever, patient, and infinitely more dangerous. The sound grows louder, multiple engines, formation flying. Brandy's experienced ear counts them. 4 aircraft, possibly 6, circling in a pattern that speaks of coordination, technology, and something else that chills him to the bone. Certainty. They know exactly where he is. Months earlier, in the concrete bunkers of Brest, German naval intelligence officers had gathered around mahogany tables thick with cigarette smoke and contempt. The reports from the Atlantic painted an increasingly grim picture, but these men clung to their assumptions with the desperation of drowning sailors clutching debris. Korvettenkapitän Heinrich Zimmermann, his uniform pristine, despite commanding a wolf pack that had lost 12 boats in 6 weeks, spread reconnaissance photographs across the table with theatrical confidence. The images showed British Consolidated Catalina flying boats and Wellington bombers, lumbering through daylight skies with the grace of pregnant whales. "Look at these flying cargo ships," Zimmermann declared, his voice thick with mockery that masked growing anxiety. "The British are reduced to sending their mail planes against our steel sharks. These Catalinas are blind as cavefish once the sun sets. No aircraft can hunt a properly handled U-boat in darkness. It is a fundamental law of naval warfare." His colleagues nodded with the fervor of men desperate to believe their own propaganda. They had good reason for confidence. German U-boat tactics had evolved through 2 years of brutal trial and refinement. Surface at night to charge batteries and communicate with base. Dive at first light. Use speed and maneuverability to escape aerial detection. The mathematics seemed simple. Aircraft carried limited fuel, flew predictable patterns, and possessed primitive radar systems that struggled to distinguish submarine periscopes from wave crests. "Besides," added Fregattenkapitän Otto Kessler, stabbing his finger at a map of the African coast, "what pilot would waste fuel searching empty waters off the Sahara? The desert protects our southern approaches better than any minefield." They could not have been more catastrophically wrong. Even as they spoke, British scientists and engineers were perfecting a technology that would transform night hunting from impossible to inevitable. The Lee Light, a powerful airborne searchlight synchronized with ASV radar, was about to turn darkness from sanctuary into trap. The Royal Air Force's Coastal Command had learned bitter lessons in the first 3 years of war. U-boats seemed to vanish like ghosts whenever aircraft appeared, diving deep and waiting for the hunters to exhaust their fuel and depart. Traditional depth charges required precise positioning over a submerged target, an almost impossible task given the primitive radar and visual limitations of 1941-era aircraft. But by September 1943, everything had changed. Wing Commander Humphrey de Verde Lee's innovation combined multiple technologies into a hunting system of devastating effectiveness. ASV Mark III radar would detect submarines on the surface at ranges exceeding 10 miles. Once radar contact was established, aircraft would approach to within 1 mile before activating the Lee Light, a 24-inch naval searchlight producing 11 million candle power, bright enough to illuminate a submarine as clearly as if it were painted in phosphorescent paint against black velvet. The system's brilliance lay not in individual components, but in their integration. Radar guided the approach. The light provided target acquisition. Newly developed depth charges with shallow-set fuses could cripple a diving submarine before it reached safe depth. Most importantly, the Lee Light's sudden activation gave U-boat crews mere seconds to react. Insufficient time for emergency dives that had saved countless submarines in daylight attacks. German naval intelligence had reports of these new British capabilities, but bureaucratic arrogance and wishful thinking prevented effective countermeasures. U-boat commanders received warnings about improved Allied radar and experimental lighting systems, but no one comprehended the tactical revolution these dry phrases represented. The U-617 represented the pinnacle of German submarine engineering when launched from Hamburg's Blohm & Voss shipyard in February 1942. Type 7C boats formed the backbone of the Kriegsmarine's Atlantic campaign, 220 feet of carefully balanced compromises between endurance, firepower, and stealth. Her pressure hull, forged from chrome molybdenum steel, could withstand depths approaching 750 feet. 14 torpedoes nestled in her forward and stern compartments, each one capable of sending an Allied merchantman to the bottom in minutes. Her diesel engines, Twin Mayan supercharged units producing 2,800 horsepower could drive her across the surface at 17 knots, fast enough to outrun most escort vessels in fair weather. Submerged, electric motors provided the silent running capability that had made U-boats the terror of convoy routes from Newfoundland to Gibraltar. Her crew of 44 represented months of intensive training in submarine schools that had refined U-boat tactics to deadly perfection. Captain Lieutenant Albrecht Brandy commanded this weapon with the skill of a master craftsman. Born in Hamburg in 1912, he had joined the Kriegsmarine in 1934, serving aboard surface vessels before transferring to the expanding U-boat arm in 1939. His first command, U-380, had sunk 19 Allied vessels in 3 patrols, earning him the Knight's Cross and promotion to command the newly commissioned U-617. The submarine's war record reflected both the golden age of U-boat warfare and its inevitable decline. Early patrols in 1942 had yielded rich harvests, 12 ships totaling 73,000 tons sent to the bottom in her first 6 months of operation. Brandy's crew developed the synchronized precision of a deadly ballet, executing surface attacks with textbook efficiency. Approach undetected, fire a spread of torpedoes from optimal range, crash dive before escorts could react, escape in the chaos that followed merchantmen breaking apart in towers of flame and steam. But by spring 1943, the Atlantic had become a different ocean. Improved convoy tactics, advanced radar, long-range aircraft, and most crucially, the breaking of German naval codes had turned the submarine war into a deadly game where Allied forces increasingly held all the advantages. U-617's later patrols yielded diminishing returns at escalating cost. Fuel grew scarce. Replacement crews arrived younger and less experienced. Radio communications became dangerous luxuries that exposed position to Allied direction-finding networks. The final patrol began in August 1943 with orders that reflected the Kriegsmarine's growing desperation. Proceed to the South Atlantic via African coastal waters. Avoid heavily patrolled convoy routes. Attack targets of opportunity, but prioritize survival over aggressive engagement. Find safe harbor in neutral Spanish Morocco, if severely damaged. The unspoken subtext was unmistakable. The U-boat war was lost, and experienced crews represented irreplaceable assets worth more than tactical victories. September 1943 found the Atlantic saturated with Allied hunter-killer groups employing tactics and technology that had transformed submarine warfare from predator versus prey into a sophisticated chess match where German players increasingly found themselves in check. High-frequency direction-finding stations dotted the Allied coastline, triangulating U-boat radio transmissions with mathematical precision. Long-range B-24 Liberators equipped with advanced radar could patrol areas the size of small countries, forcing submarines to remain submerged for extended periods that drained batteries and crew endurance. Most critically, the Enigma breakthrough had given Allied intelligence unprecedented insight into German naval operations. U-boat patrol routes, refueling rendezvous, and tactical communications were intercepted, decoded, and disseminated to hunting groups often within hours of transmission. German submarines found themselves trapped in an invisible net of electronic surveillance that grew tighter with each passing month. The night of September 12th brought perfect hunting conditions to the Moroccan coast. Clear skies provided excellent visibility for aircraft crews. Calm seas eliminated wave interference that could mask radar returns. Most importantly, ultra-intelligence had identified U-617's approximate position through decoded radio traffic from the previous day. Royal Air Force Squadron 179, operating from Gibraltar, had been hunting German submarines along the African coast for 6 months, using the latest Lee light equipment. Their Wellington bombers, ungainly by day but deadly by night, carried the electronic eyes and artificial sun that had transformed nocturnal submarine warfare. Squadron leader James McPherson, a veteran of 43 operational sorties, briefed his crews with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through 2 years of combat flying. Intelligence indicates a U-boat attempting passage south along the Moroccan coast, McPherson announced to the assembled air crew in Gibraltar's sweltering operations hut. Previous intercepts suggest this boat has been running submerged during daylight hours, surfacing after sunset to charge batteries and make way. Standard night hunting procedures. Radar sweep at 15-mile intervals. Lee light activation only when we have positive identification. The crews understood their business with the professional competence of men who had perfected killing through repetition. Navigator plots course to patrol area. Radar operator sweeps assigned sector with mechanical precision. Wireless operator monitors German submarine frequencies for transmission intercepts. Bomb aimer prepares depth charge settings for shallow water attack. Pilot maintains altitude and airspeed that optimize radar coverage while conserving fuel for extended patrol. At 23:47 hours, radar contact. Range, 11 miles, bearing 95 degrees. A solid return moving northeast at estimated 14 knots. Precisely the speed and heading intelligence had predicted for U-617's escape attempt. McPherson banked his Wellington toward the contact, reducing altitude to 800 feet, while his bomb aimer armed 6 depth charges set for 50-foot detonation depth. The radar return grew stronger, more defined. No merchant vessel traveled alone at night off the African coast in September 1943. No Allied submarine operated in this area. The contact could only be a German U-boat, running on the surface with the desperate urgency of a hunted animal seeking escape. In U-617's control room, the first indication of disaster came not from lookouts, but from the boat's primitive radar detector. A simple device that could identify enemy radar emissions, but provided no directional information or range estimates. The equipment suddenly erupted in electronic screaming that sent ice through every German heart. "Radar contact," shouted Oberfähnrich Karl Weber, the young officer manning the detection equipment. "Strong signal, very close." Brandy grabbed the speaking tube connecting him to the conning tower lookouts. "Bridge, aircraft contact." "Nothing visible, Herr Kalau," came the reply. "Clear horizon all around." But the radar detector's shrieking confirmed what every experienced U-boat commander had learned to fear most. Somewhere in the darkness above, electronic eyes had found them. The hunters were approaching with technology that made darkness meaningless and concealment impossible. Brandy faced the classic submarine dilemma that had claimed dozens of U-boats in recent months. Crash dive immediately and hope to reach safe depth before aircraft arrived overhead. Or remain surfaced and attempt to outrun pursuit, gambling that German engineering could triumph over Allied electronics. Both options carried fatal risks. Diving required time, precious seconds during which aircraft could close range and deliver attacks against a defenseless target. Running meant remaining exposed to radar tracking that would guide hunters with mathematical precision. Experience, training, and desperate hope made the decision for him. "Clear the bridge. Prepare to dive." The night exploded in artificial daylight. McPherson's Wellington had approached to within 200 yards before activating the lee light, and the submarine appeared in the sudden illumination like a museum exhibit under floodlights. Every rivet, every detail of the conning tower, every German sailor scrambling for the hatches stood revealed with crystal clarity against the dark water. "Target acquired," McPherson announced over the intercom with the calm professionalism that distinguished veteran aircrews. Commencing attack run. The Wellington dove toward U-617 like a mechanical hawk, its engines screaming as McPherson pushed the aircraft to maximum speed. In the bomb bay, depth charges hung ready for release, each one containing 250 pounds of Amatol explosive designed to crush submarine hulls through hydrostatic shock. German lookouts had seconds to register the approaching aircraft before abandoning their posts and diving for the conning tower hatch. The submarine's anti-aircraft guns, twin 20mm cannons that might have provided some defense, remained unmanned as the crew prioritized emergency diving procedures over surface combat. U-617's diving alarm shrieked through every compartment as ballast tanks flooded and the boat's bow angled sharply downward. But 18 months of combat experience had taught Brandy that modern aircraft attacked faster than submarines could dive. The British bomber would reach weapon release point long before U-617 could submerge deeply enough to survive the coming explosion. The first depth charge detonated 50 feet below U-617's keel, just as her conning tower disappeared beneath the surface. The explosion lifted the submarine's stern clear of the water, buckling steel plates and rupturing fuel lines that sent diesel oil streaming across the surface in an iridescent slick. The second charge exploded closer, crushing ballast tank valves and jamming the rudder mechanism that controlled the boat's direction. Inside the submarine, the attack felt like being trapped inside a massive bell during an earthquake. Every loose object became a projectile. Light bulbs shattered, gauge faces cracked. Men were hurled against bulkheads, with bone-breaking force as the boat rolled and twisted under the hammer blows of underwater explosions. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red as damage reports flooded the control room. Stern planes jammed. Rudder not responding. Oil leak in the engine room. Each report confirmed what Brandy already knew. His submarine was dying, and the sea that had sheltered her for 18 months was about to become her grave. More aircraft arrived, drawn by radio calls and the growing oil slick that marked U-617's position like a funeral pyre. Wellington and Hudson bombers circled overhead, their ley lights turning the ocean surface into a deadly theater where every movement stood exposed to watching eyes. A second attack run punched 3 more depth charges into the water around the crippled submarine. The explosions shattered her port ballast tanks and flooded the forward torpedo room, sending U-617 to the bottom in 180 feet of water, with her bow pointing toward the Moroccan coast like an arrow aimed at sanctuary. But even death brought no peace. The submarine's hull, designed to withstand depth charges in deep water, began buckling under the crushing weight of tons of seawater flooding through ruptured seams. Bulkheads groaned. Steel plates bent inward with sounds like breaking bones. The boat was disintegrating around her trapped crew. "Blow all tanks!" Brandy ordered, activating the emergency ballast system that might, if they were extraordinarily fortunate, lift U-617 off the bottom and back to the surface. Compressed air hissed through damaged valves, forcing some water from the ballast tanks, but not enough to overcome the flooding in the forward compartments. Slowly, agonizingly, the submarine began rising through the dark water. Her stern broke surface first, followed by the twisted remains of her conning tower. Oil and debris spread across the waves like the entrails of a gutted whale. U-617 had returned to the surface, but she would never dive again. The crew struggled through flooding compartments toward the stern, where emergency hatches might still provide escape routes. Many were injured, broken bones from the depth charge explosions, burns from ruptured steam lines, cuts from flying debris.
They moved with the mechanical precision of men trained for catastrophe, but their faces reflected the knowledge that their war was ending in the worst possible way, not in glorious combat, but in helpless submission to enemies who had mastered the tools of modern warfare. McPherson's aircraft circled overhead, their lights illuminating the dying submarine like spotlights on a stage. Radio transmissions crackled between the hunters, coordinating the final act of a drama that had been rehearsed in dozens of similar encounters throughout 1943. U-boats surfaced, dead in the water. McPherson reported to Gibraltar Control, requesting surface vessels for prisoner recovery. But U-617's ordeal was far from over. The depth charge explosions had damaged more than her hull. They had also destroyed her navigation equipment and compass systems. When Brandy ordered the engine started in a desperate attempt to reach shore, the submarine moved in unpredictable directions, her jammed rudder sending her in slow circles like a wounded animal seeking shelter. The Moroccan coast appeared close enough to swim to, a dark line against the star-filled sky that promised safety and internment instead of death and drowning. Brandy made the decision that would define the remainder of his crew's war: beach the submarine rather than allow her to sink in deep water where rescue would be impossible. U-617 limped toward shore on her remaining diesel engine, trailing oil and smoke while Allied aircraft maintained their deadly vigil overhead. The boat's hull scraped against underwater rocks as she entered the shallows, her keel grinding against sand and stone with the sound of metal being flayed from bone. Finally, with a shudder that ran through every frame and plate, the submarine came to rest in 20 feet of water, half submerged, half beached. Her war ended on the margin between sea and land. The crew abandoned ship with the disciplined efficiency that had characterized German submarine operations throughout the war. They carried wounded comrades, salvaged what equipment might prove useful, and maintained military bearing even in defeat. Some wept. Others stared in shock at the twisted wreckage that had been their home for 18 months. All understood that they had witnessed the end of an era. Dawn revealed the full extent of their predicament. U-617 lay broken on a desolate stretch of Moroccan coastline, her hull split open like a dissected specimen.
The nearest settlement was invisible beyond rolling sand dunes that stretched to the horizon like a yellow ocean. The men had escaped drowning only to face the possibility of death by exposure in one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. Capitan Lieutenant Brandy gathered his surviving crew, 39 men, 5 having died in the depth charge attacks, and addressed them with the calm authority that had earned their respect through months of shared danger. They would march inland, seeking assistance from Spanish colonial authorities in Morocco. They would maintain military discipline and mutual support. They would survive this ordeal as they had survived countless others. What followed was an odyssey that transformed German submariners into desert wanderers, trading the claustrophobic confines of their steel boat for the infinite emptiness of the Sahara. For 3 days they walked southeast through landscapes that seemed designed to humble human ambition. The sun burned their pale submarine skin. Sand filled their boots, their clothes, their mouths. Water, the element that had sustained and threatened them for 18 months, became more precious than ammunition. The desert taught them lessons that no submarine school had anticipated. Navigation by star positions, rationing water in teaspoons rather than gallons, finding shelter in shallow depressions that provided degrees of shade rather than protection. Walking at night when temperatures dropped to bearable levels, resting during the day when the sun transformed sand into a furnace that could kill through simple exposure. Some crew members suffered complete psychological collapse, their minds unable to process the transition from underwater warfare to desert survival. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, the submarine's torpedo specialist, began seeing mirages of U-boats surfacing from sand dunes. Matrosengefreiter Fritz Becker repeatedly tried to dive beneath the sand when aircraft appeared overhead, his reflexes programmed by months of emergency procedures that had no relevance in their current environment. Others adapted with the resilience that had made German submarine crews among the most effective naval forces in military history. They shared water equally regardless of rank. They carried injured comrades without complaint. They maintained watch schedules and military protocols, even when civilian logic suggested abandoning such formalities. The same discipline that had made U-617 a deadly weapon now became the framework for survival in circumstances no naval manual had contemplated. On the 3rd day, salvation appeared in the form of Spanish colonial troops conducting routine patrol operations along the disputed border between Spanish Morocco and French territories to the south. The soldiers initially mistook the German sailors for Allied aircrew who had crashed in the desert. Their sunburned faces and tattered uniforms bore no resemblance to the precise military appearance typically associated with Kriegsmarine personnel. Captain Eduardo Morales, commanding the Spanish patrol, described the encounter in a report that would eventually reach British intelligence through diplomatic channels. "We discovered 39 men in German naval uniforms, approximately 40 kilometers southeast of the Atlantic coast. They appeared to have been walking for several days and were in serious need of medical attention. Their leader, who identified himself as a submarine commander, requested internment under international law governing naval personnel in neutral territory. The Spanish, maintaining careful neutrality in a war that had consumed most of Europe, followed established protocols for handling belligerent military personnel. The Germans would be disarmed, provided medical care, and transported to internment facilities where they would remain until hostilities ended. This arrangement suited all parties. Germany retained hope that experienced crews might eventually return to service. Britain removed dangerous enemies from active operations, and Spain avoided complications that might draw them into direct conflict. The journey to internment began with a truck ride across landscapes that gradually transformed from desert wasteland to cultivated valleys approaching the Spanish colonial capital of Tetuan. For men accustomed to viewing the world through periscopes and listening to it through hydrophones, the visual panorama of North Africa provided sensory overload that some found overwhelming. Colors seemed impossibly bright. Sounds carried vast distances across empty terrain. The sky extended in all directions without the comforting limitations imposed by submarine hulls and cramped compartments. Brandy used the journey to compose his final war diary entry, writing on paper provided by sympathetic Spanish guards who understood that military men needed to record significant events regardless of political circumstances. September 15, 1943. U-617 destroyed by enemy aircraft off the Moroccan coast. Crews successfully evacuated to neutral territory. We began this patrol as hunters. We ended as refugees. The sea has rendered its judgment, and we accept the verdict with honor intact, but illusions destroyed. The internment camp at Tetuan represented a curious footnote to the broader war. A neutral zone where German, Italian, British, and American military personnel coexisted under Spanish supervision, while their nations continued fighting savage battles across 3 continents. The facilities, converted from foreign legion barracks, provided basic accommodation and adequate food, while maintaining security sufficient to prevent escapes that might embarrass Spanish neutrality. For U-617 survivors, internment brought complex emotions that mixed relief with profound loss. They were alive, safe from the escalating brutality of the Atlantic submarine war, and reasonably certain of surviving until hostilities ended. But they were also witnesses to their own military irrelevance, removed from a conflict that continued without their participation or contribution. Intelligence reports filtered through the camp describing the deteriorating situation facing German submarine forces. U-boat losses had reached unsustainable levels throughout 1943, with experienced crews being killed faster than training programs could replace them. The technological advantages that had briefly made submarines masters of the Atlantic had evaporated under Allied innovations that transformed hunting from difficult to routine. Some internees adapted to their circumstances by establishing educational programs, teaching languages and technical subjects to pass time productively. Others sank into depression that Spanish medical personnel struggled to address with limited psychiatric resources. A few, including Brandy, used their enforced leisure to analyze the tactical and strategic factors that had led to Germany's submarine warfare defeat. Brandy's analysis, preserved in documents that would later interest Allied intelligence officers, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the technological and organizational advantages that had shifted naval warfare's balance decisively against Germany. Radio direction finding had made submarine communications a liability rather than an asset. Advanced radar had eliminated the cover of darkness that submarines required for surface operations. Improved anti-submarine weapons had transformed aircraft from annoyances into deadly threats. But beyond technology, Brandy identified more fundamental factors that had doomed German submarine operations. Allied industrial capacity had simply overwhelmed German production capabilities. American shipyards were launching merchant vessels faster than U-boats could sink them. British and Canadian aircraft factories were producing submarine hunters in quantities that made losses acceptable and replacement inevitable. Most critically, Allied code breaking had provided intelligence advantages that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. German submarines were operating in an environment where their enemies possessed near-perfect knowledge of patrol routes, refueling schedules, and tactical intentions. Under such circumstances, individual heroism and professional competence became irrelevant variables in equations that favored the side with superior information processing capabilities. Winter 1943 brought news that confirmed Brandy's analysis. Admiral Karl Dönitz, architect of Germany's submarine warfare strategy, had withdrawn U-boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes where they had achieved their greatest successes. The Battle of the Atlantic, for practical purposes, was over, with Allied victory so complete that German submarines no longer posed significant threats to oceanic commerce. The psychological impact of this revelation varied among U-617 survivors. Younger crew members, some barely 20 years old, struggled to comprehend that their training and sacrifice had been rendered meaningless by circumstances beyond their control. Veterans like Brandy, who had witnessed the submarine war's evolution from early successes to final defeat, found grim satisfaction in having their tactical assessments confirmed by strategic reality.
Spring 1944 brought changes to the internment routine as Spanish authorities prepared for eventual prisoner exchanges and repatriations that would follow Germany's anticipated defeat. Red Cross representatives interviewed internees to document their treatment and assess their willingness to continue fighting if returned to German control.
The responses revealed the complex loyalties and motivations that had sustained German military resistance despite increasingly hopeless strategic circumstances. Some crew members expressed continued commitment to Nazi ideology and declared their intention to resume combat operations if given the opportunity. Others, particularly older sailors who had fought in World War I, spoke privately of their relief at being removed from a conflict they now viewed as both unwinnable and pointless. A few, including Brandy, adopted positions that combined personal honor with realistic assessment of Germany's military situation. "I serve the fatherland, not the party," Brandy told Red Cross interviewer Heinrich Müller, a Swiss citizen conducting assessments for potential prisoner exchanges. "My duty was to command U-617 and protect her crew. That duty ended when the boat was destroyed. My new duty is to ensure these men survive the war and return home to rebuild what we have lost." Summer 1944 brought news of the Normandy landings and the accelerating collapse of German resistance on multiple fronts. For internees following the war's progress through carefully monitored radio broadcasts and occasional newspaper access, the strategic situation became increasingly clear. Germany was losing the war decisively, and the only remaining questions concerned timing and surrender terms. The psychological adjustment to this reality proved especially difficult for submarine crews who had experienced both the exhilaration of early victories and the trauma of eventual defeat. Their war had been intensely personal, fought in small units where individual competence directly influenced survival. The abstract strategic factors that determined ultimate victory or defeat, industrial capacity, resource allocation, technological innovation, had seemed less relevant than tactical skill and personal courage. But internment provided opportunity for reflection and analysis that active service had precluded. Brandy began writing detailed assessments of submarine warfare that would later influence post-war naval thinking. His central thesis, that technological warfare demanded industrial and scientific capabilities beyond Germany's reach, challenged romantic notions of military heroism that had sustained German resistance throughout the conflict. "We believed that superior training and individual courage could overcome material disadvantages," Brandy wrote in notes that Spanish authorities allowed him to maintain. "This belief sustained us through months of increasing danger and diminishing success." But wars are ultimately decided by mathematics rather than mythology. The side with better technology, more resources, and superior intelligence will prevail regardless of individual heroism. Autumn 1944 brought the first concrete indications that internment might end before the war's conclusion. American diplomatic pressure on Spain suggested that German military personnel might be transferred to Allied custody for eventual repatriation to the United States or Britain. Such transfers would technically violate Spanish neutrality, but the diplomatic benefits of cooperation with the obviously victorious Allies outweighed concerns about international law. The prospect of transfer to Allied prisoner of war camps provoked mixed reactions among U-617 survivors. American or British camps would likely provide better medical care and more adequate food than Spanish facilities could offer. But they would also represent final acknowledgement that Germany had lost the war and that return to active service was impossible. Individual crew members made different choices based on personal circumstances and political convictions. Those with families in areas likely to be occupied by Soviet forces preferred transfer to Western custody. Others, particularly those from regions that might remain under German control, chose to remain in Spanish internment until war's end allowed direct repatriation. Brandy faced a particularly complex decision. His technical knowledge of submarine operations and anti-submarine warfare would be valuable to Allied intelligence services. Cooperation might provide better treatment and faster repatriation, but it would also constitute betrayal of military oaths and comradely obligations. The choice reflected broader moral dilemmas that confronted German military personnel as their nation's defeat became inevitable. Winter 1945 resolved these dilemmas through events that made individual choices irrelevant. Germany's surrender in May 1945 ended the war in Europe and transformed all German military personnel from potential combatants into defeated enemies requiring processing and eventual repatriation. Spanish neutrality no longer provided protection from Allied demands for custody of German prisoners. The transfer to Allied control occurred with the bureaucratic efficiency that characterized military operations in 1945. British transport aircraft arrived at Tetuan airfield to collect German internees for transfer to processing centers in Gibraltar and eventually to permanent prisoner of war camps in Britain or North America. The operation proceeded without ceremony or hostility. simply the administrative cleanup required by war's end. For U-617 survivors, the flight to Gibraltar provided their first aerial view of the waters where their submarine had met its end 18 months earlier. The Moroccan coast appeared peaceful and empty, showing no trace of the drama that had unfolded there in September 1943. The sea had reclaimed the wreckage, and nature had begun the process of healing wounds that human conflict had inflicted upon the landscape. British interrogation centres at Gibraltar conducted detailed interviews with German submarine personnel to extract intelligence information that might prove useful in future conflicts. The questioning focused particularly on technological aspects of U-boat operations, radar detection capabilities, communication procedures, tactical innovations developed during the war's final phases. Brandy's interviews revealed information that confirmed Allied assessments of German submarine warfare's decline. Technical problems had plagued advanced U-boat designs. Communication security had been compromised by Allied code-breaking efforts. Training programs had deteriorated as experienced instructors were killed in combat, and replacements lacked practical knowledge. But the interviews also revealed the human dimension of submarine warfare that intelligence reports typically omitted. The psychological stress of prolonged underwater operations, the bonds of mutual dependence that developed among crew members, the mixture of pride and terror that characterized life aboard weapons designed to kill and be killed. "We knew we were losing the war by early 1943, Brandy told British intelligence officer Commander David Richardson during one interview session. But we continued fighting because surrender was not an option for professional military men. Our duty was to serve until death, or capture ended our ability to contribute to the war effort." Richardson, himself a veteran of anti-submarine operations, found such statements both admirable and troubling. German submarine crews had demonstrated remarkable courage and competence, even in obviously hopeless circumstances. Such dedication commanded professional respect, but it had also prolonged a conflict that caused unnecessary casualties on both sides. The final phase of internment occurred in prisoner-of-war camps, designed to house large numbers of German military personnel pending repatriation arrangements. Camp 198 in Yorkshire provided accommodation for submarine crews, aircraft personnel, and other German military specialists whose technical knowledge required careful handling during the transition from war to peace. Life in British prisoner-of-war camps followed patterns established throughout the conflict. Work details provided productive activity and modest compensation. Educational programs offered opportunities for language learning and skill development. Recreation periods allowed organized sports and cultural activities that maintained morale and group cohesion. For submarine crews accustomed to cramped quarters and constant danger, the camps represented luxury accommodations despite their obviously custodial nature. Private bunks, adequate food, medical care, and regular correspondence with families provided comforts that had been unavailable during active service. Some prisoners adapted quickly to routine that resembled peacetime military service more than wartime conditions. Others struggled with psychological adjustment to defeat and captivity. Depression affected significant numbers of former submarine personnel who had defined themselves through professional competence in highly specialized roles. Removal from that environment, combined with knowledge that their technical skills were now obsolete, created identity crises that camp medical personnel struggled to address. Brandy emerged as an informal leader among submarine prisoners, using his command experience to maintain discipline and morale during the difficult transition period. He organized discussion groups that analyzed the war's lessons, led educational programs that prepared crew members for civilian life, and maintained the military bearing that provided psychological continuity with their service careers. His private correspondence, portions of which survive in family archives, reveals the complex emotions that captivity produced among German military professionals. Pride in service competed with regret about the war's outcome. Relief at survival conflicted with guilt about comrades who had died. Hope for eventual return home mixed with uncertainty about what kind of Germany would emerge from defeat and occupation. "We fought honorably for a cause that proved unworthy of our sacrifice," Brandy wrote to his wife in Hamburg in December 1945. "History will judge our enemy's cause as more just than ours, but it cannot diminish the courage and competence we demonstrated in serving our fatherland. We remain soldiers, even in defeat, and soldiers preserved their honor regardless of political circumstances. Repatriation began in 1946, as Allied authorities established procedures for returning German prisoners to civilian life in occupied Germany. The process prioritized technical specialists whose skills might contribute to economic reconstruction, while retaining personnel suspected of war crimes or strong Nazi convictions for extended interrogation and denazification processing. U-617's surviving crew members found themselves classified as low-risk personnel suitable for early release. British intelligence assessments concluded that submarine warfare, despite its devastating effectiveness against Allied shipping, had generally been conducted according to established naval conventions. Unlike SS units or concentration camp personnel, U-boat crews could be processed quickly through denazification procedures and released to assist in Germany's reconstruction. The train journey from British prisoner-of-war camps to occupied Germany provided Brandy and his men with their first glimpse of war's true devastation. Through grimy windows, they witnessed landscapes that resembled lunar surfaces more than the civilized European countryside they remembered. Railroad bridges had been replaced by temporary Bailey spans. Cities appeared as geometric patterns of rubble, interrupted by occasional standing walls that marked where buildings had once stood. Hamburg presented the most shocking revelation. The Blohm and Voss shipyard, where U-617 had been born, lay in ruins that made the submarine pens resemble abstract sculptures of twisted concrete and rusted steel. The residential districts where many crew members had grown up were simply gone, replaced by tent cities and prefabricated barracks that housed survivors of bombing campaigns that had killed more civilians in single nights than U-boat warfare had claimed in entire months. For men who had spent 18 months in the cramped confines of a submarine, the vast emptiness of destroyed cities created psychological disorientation, almost as severe as their initial capture. The urban landscapes they had fought to defend no longer existed. The families they had hoped to protect lived in conditions that made prisoner-of-war camps seem luxurious by comparison. Victory or defeat had become meaningless concepts when survival itself required complete reconstruction of social and economic systems. Brandy's wife, Martha, had survived the Hamburg firestorms of 1943, but their apartment building had been destroyed along with most of their possessions. She was living in a basement shelter with their 2 children, subsisting on Allied food rations that provided barely adequate nutrition. The reunion, long anticipated during months of internment, proved emotionally devastating, as both husband and wife struggled to reconcile their memories of pre-war life with post-war reality. "I dreamed of coming home to the life we had built together," Brandy wrote in diary entries that his family preserved. "Instead, I found myself a stranger in a destroyed land, trying to comfort people whose suffering exceeded anything we experienced in combat." The war had ended, but its consequences had only begun to reveal themselves. The practical challenges of civilian reintegration overwhelmed administrative systems designed for peacetime conditions. Housing was virtually non-existent. Employment opportunities were limited to manual labor in reconstruction projects that paid wages insufficient for family support. Educational institutions had been destroyed or converted to refugee centers. Medical facilities struggled with shortages of equipment and medications that made treating war injuries extremely difficult. Many former submarine crew members found themselves psychologically unprepared for civilian life after years of military service in highly structured environments. The submarine had provided clear hierarchy, defined responsibilities, and shared purpose that civilian employment could rarely match. Heinrich Weber, U-617's former communications specialist, described the adjustment as learning to live without orders, without missions, without the certainty that your actions served some larger purpose. The technical skills that had made German submarine crews among the world's most effective naval forces proved largely irrelevant in occupied Germany. Allied authorities had dismantled what remained of German naval facilities and forbidden the construction of vessels larger than fishing boats. Knowledge of torpedo systems, underwater navigation, and submarine tactics had no civilian applications in a nation prohibited from possessing military forces beyond minimal police units. Some crew members adapted by pursuing education in fields that utilized their mathematical and mechanical aptitudes. The University of Hamburg, rebuilt with Allied assistance, offered engineering programs that attracted veterans seeking to transform military experience into civilian careers. But competition for limited positions was intense, and preference often went to younger students without military backgrounds that occupation authorities viewed with suspicion. Others found employment in reconstruction projects that required technical knowledge but involved no military applications. Kurt Fischer, U-617's chief engineer, worked on harbor reconstruction in Bremen, using his understanding of marine engineering to design civilian port facilities. The irony was profound. Skills developed to destroy Allied shipping now contributed to rebuilding commerce that would ultimately benefit Germany's former enemies. The psychological adjustment proved more difficult than practical challenges for many veterans. Submarine service had created bonds of mutual dependence that civilian life could rarely replicate. The shared danger, confined spaces, and collective responsibility for survival had forged relationships that peacetime employment seldom matched. Many former crew members gathered regularly in Hamburg taverns to maintain connections that provided emotional continuity with their military service. These informal reunions served multiple purposes beyond social interaction. They provided mutual support networks for men struggling with similar adjustment problems. They preserved institutional memory of submarine operations that Allied intelligence services continued to study. Most importantly, they maintained dignity and professional identity among veterans whose military service had been rendered politically problematic by Germany's defeat and subsequent revelations about Nazi war crimes. Brandy emerged as an informal leader among submarine veterans, using his command experience to organize assistance programs for crew members facing severe difficulties. He established contact networks that helped locate employment opportunities, coordinated mutual aid for families in extreme need, and maintained correspondence with former comrades who had emigrated to other countries seeking better prospects. His efforts attracted attention from Allied intelligence services interested in maintaining contact with German naval personnel, whose technical knowledge might prove valuable during the emerging Cold War. The Soviet Union's growing naval capabilities created strategic requirements for Western navies to understand submarine warfare from operational perspectives that only experienced practitioners could provide. These contacts led to consulting arrangements that provided modest income while serving broader Western security interests. Brandy and other submarine veterans participated in classified conferences where they analyzed Soviet naval developments and contributed to NATO anti-submarine warfare doctrine. Such work offered partial validation of their professional competence while serving causes they could support without political compromise. The moral complexity of such arrangements troubled some veterans who viewed cooperation with former enemies as betrayal of fallen comrades. Others embraced opportunities to serve Western democratic values that seemed more compatible with German naval traditions than Nazi ideology had been. These divisions reflected broader struggles within German society to distinguish between military service and political systems that such service had supported. Brandy's position emphasized professional rather than political considerations. "We serve Germany, not the Nazi Party," he explained to crew members who questioned his cooperation with Allied authorities. "Our duty was to protect German interests, and those interests now require integration with Western democratic institutions rather than resistance to them." Such pragmatic approaches gradually gained acceptance as Cold War tensions made former enemies into allies against Soviet expansion. West Germany's strategic importance to NATO created incentives for rehabilitation of German military professionals whose expertise could contribute to collective defense arrangements. Submarine veterans found themselves valued for technical knowledge that had been condemned as threatening during the immediate post-war period. The broader German public remained ambivalent about military commemoration during the 1950s and 1960s. National identity required careful balance between honoring sacrifice and acknowledging guilt about Nazi war crimes. Submarine veterans occupied particularly complex positions in these discussions, having served with professional competence in warfare that had legitimate military objectives despite being conducted by a regime whose ultimate purposes proved morally indefensible. Memorial services for U-617's casualties reflected these tensions. The crew members who had died in the depth charge attacks deserved honor for their service, but public ceremonies risked appearing to glorify warfare that had caused enormous suffering. Family members organized modest remembrance gatherings that emphasized personal loss rather than military achievement, seeking to preserve memory while avoiding political controversy. International perspectives on German submarine warfare evolved gradually as Cold War alliances replaced World War II hostilities. Former Allied nations found themselves cooperating with West Germany against Soviet threats, creating diplomatic requirements to emphasize shared democratic values rather than wartime animosities. Professional military cooperation between NATO navies necessitated acknowledgement of German naval competence that political circumstances had temporarily obscured. These changing attitudes enabled more open discussion of submarine warfare's technical and tactical dimensions. Maritime museums began developing exhibits that analyzed U-boat operations from professional rather than purely political perspectives. Academic historians gained access to classified documents that revealed the sophisticated intelligence and technological factors that had determined the Battle of the Atlantic's outcome. Brandy contributed to these historical efforts through detailed memoirs that analyzed submarine operations with the objectivity that time and perspective had made possible. His writings emphasized systematic rather than heroic factors in modern warfare, demonstrating how technological innovation, industrial capacity, and intelligence superiority had proven more decisive than traditional military virtues. Individual courage and professional competence remained necessary components of military effectiveness, Brandy wrote in conclusions that summarized his wartime experience. But victory in modern warfare depends ultimately on systematic advantages in technology, intelligence, and resource allocation, rather than personal heroism alone. We fought bravely and skillfully, but we were defeated by opponents who had superior tools and better information. Such insights proved prophetic as Cold War naval competition reproduced many patterns that had characterized World War II submarine warfare. Nuclear propulsion, advanced sonar systems, and satellite navigation created new technological dimensions to underwater combat, but fundamental principles remained constant. Victory would belong to forces that most effectively integrated human competence with technological capability and institutional coordination. The physical remains of U-617 continued to deteriorate beneath Moroccan coastal waters, gradually surrendering their steel and brass to corrosion processes that would eventually erase all traces of the submarine's existence. Local fishermen occasionally recovered artifacts that ocean currents had dislodged from the wreck site, but most items lacked obvious historical significance that might have preserved them for future study. Moroccan authorities conducted salvage operations during the 1950s to recover valuable metals from various World War II wrecks along their coastline. U-617's hull provided several tons of steel and brass that contributed to local reconstruction projects, but no systematic effort was made to preserve historically significant components or document the submarine's final configuration. By the 1970s, little remained of the vessel beyond scattered debris buried in shifting coastal sands. Occasional pieces of equipment emerged during storms that disturbed underwater sediments, but these artifacts typically entered local markets as curiosities rather than museum collections. The submarine's story survived primarily in official records and personal accounts rather than physical evidence. German naval museums eventually developed exhibits that honored submarine crews' sacrifice while acknowledging the problematic nature of the cause they had served. These displays emphasized professional competence and personal courage while providing historical context about Nazi war aims and the legitimate Allied response to German aggression. Such balanced presentations reflected mature understanding of warfare's moral complexity that immediate post-war emotions had prevented. The educational value of U-617's story extended beyond military history to broader questions about technology, leadership, and human endurance under extreme circumstances. Business schools used submarine warfare case studies to illustrate decision-making under pressure, technological adaptation, and organizational effectiveness in competitive environments. These civilian applications demonstrated the continuing relevance of military experience for understanding contemporary challenges in fields far removed from warfare. The systematic thinking, technical competence, and leadership skills that submarine service had developed proved valuable in corporate environments that face similar requirements for coordination, innovation, and performance under pressure. Brandy's later career exemplified such transfers of military experience to civilian applications. His work in marine engineering contributed to Hamburg's emergence as a major commercial port, while his consulting on underwater construction projects utilized knowledge gained through submarine operations. The technical expertise that had once threatened Allied shipping now supported international commerce that benefited all participants in the global economy. The human legacy of U-617's crew continued through family members who preserved their stories and transmitted lessons about courage, duty, and professional excellence to subsequent generations. Children and grandchildren of submarine veterans often pursued careers in engineering, maritime industries, or military service, carrying forward values that their predecessors had demonstrated under the most challenging circumstances. These family traditions reflected the complex inheritance that German military service had created for post-war generations. Pride in professional competence and personal courage coexisted with acknowledgement of political mistakes that had rendered such virtues strategically meaningless. The challenge involved preserving valuable human qualities while rejecting ideological frameworks that had misdirected them toward destructive purposes. Contemporary German society has achieved remarkable success in addressing these moral complexities while maintaining democratic institutions and international cooperation. The Federal Republic's integration into NATO and the European Union demonstrated that former enemies could become trusted allies when shared values replaced nationalist competition. Such achievements validated the sacrifices of those who had fought honorably, even in ultimately unjust causes. The final assessment of U-617's story must acknowledge both its immediate tragedy and its broader historical significance. 44 brave men served their country with skill and dedication, ultimately giving their lives in service to a cause that proved unworthy of their sacrifice. Their individual courage deserves recognition regardless of political circumstances that rendered their efforts strategically counterproductive. But their story also illustrates larger truths about modern warfare that transcend specific conflicts or national perspectives. Technology, intelligence, and industrial coordination increasingly determine military outcomes more decisively than traditional virtues like bravery and tactical skill. Democratic societies possess systematic advantages in these areas that authoritarian regimes struggle to match, despite often superior individual performance by military personnel. The submarine war's outcome thus reflected not just Allied technological superiority, but deeper institutional advantages that democratic systems provided for innovation, coordination, and adaptation. Open societies could mobilize scientific communities, coordinate complex industrial programs, and integrate intelligence capabilities more effectively than totalitarian systems that relied primarily on central direction and individual heroism. These lessons remain relevant for understanding contemporary security challenges that require similar combinations of technological innovation, international cooperation, and institutional effectiveness. The courage and competence that U-617's crew demonstrated retain value as necessary components of military capability, but they must be embedded within democratic frameworks that direct such qualities toward constructive rather than destructive purposes.
History preserves their memory not as models for emulation, but as reminders of human potential that can serve either noble or ignoble purposes, depending on political systems that direct individual sacrifice. Their story honors the courage while condemning the cause, preserving lessons that remain valuable for future generations facing similar challenges in different forms.
The desert winds continue to shift sands across the Moroccan coastline, where U-617's final chapter was written in September 1943. Time has erased most physical traces of that dramatic encounter between human courage and technological innovation. But the lessons remain, embedded in historical records and family memories that preserve essential truths about warfare, leadership, and the eternal human struggle to serve worthy purposes with honor and competence. What should we cover next? Subscribe and share your thoughts on this video. Your feedback and support are immensely valuable and help me keep improving the content.